Well, we are in a series right now called Come and See. And this series is in the Gospel of John. And what we're highlighting in the Gospel of John is something that John himself highlights in the ministry of Jesus, which is that Jesus, as he was beginning his ministry, he actually created space within his community for people to come and see. He created space for people to actually sort of see Jesus, to experience some of him, to listen to his teaching, and to process without yet fully believing, without yet fully sort of going on board with Jesus. And so it's this remarkable phenomenon where Jesus invited people to follow him and yet didn't have to fully believe him. However, the past few weeks we've seen that as Jesus has talked to various people, that Jesus, in fact, does want people to believe in him. And the text we just read, this person believes in him. And yet we see that the aspect of his ministry is that he wanted people to come and to see. That people often won't believe unless they're able to come and to see and to create space to actually process who Jesus is. Now, if you're new to Fellowship Denver, our hope as a church is to see a gospel movement that fills Denver with disciples of Jesus. Like our hope is to see a whole movement of the gospel, and the gospel just means everything about Jesus, everything Jesus said and did, his life, teachings, death, resurrection, that's the gospel. So our hope is to see a movement, a Jesus movement that fills this city, fills this community with disciples of Jesus. So what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? A disciple is a term, in Greek, it's mathetos. And mathetos is where we get the idea of mathematics from, but it simply means a learner or an apprentice. So our hope as a church is to see a movement of the gospel that fills Denver with learners of Jesus, that fills this city with people who are actually apprenticed themselves to Jesus. That's what we want to see. And so a lot of what we do as a church on Sunday and throughout the week, we roll up our sleeves and we think, what does it look like for us to actually do the hard work of discipleship together? Now, today, what we have in this text, I think, are three critical things that we have to learn in order to continue growing as disciples of Jesus. There are going to be three things that if we're going to take following Jesus, apprenticing ourselves to Jesus seriously, that we're going to have to learn, and they all derive from this text. Now, here's the things that we're going to learn. We're going to learn something about what it looks like to engage our community. We're going to learn something about Jesus. There's something we have to learn that's unique, actually, about who Jesus is. And then we're going to learn something about the nature of belief. What does it mean to actually believe? Now, so those are the three things that we're going to learn. Here's the deal, though, with these three things that we're going to learn this morning. They all come from the text. They all derive from this text. And yet, they're not terribly related to each other. How many of you in your kitchen have something called a junk drawer? Any of you have a junk drawer? We do, and I love the junk drawer, not because it's filled with junk, but because it's filled with really important things like scissors and pencils and potato chip clips and pens and random pieces of paper that you actually need, all together in a single drawer. There's no real category for them anywhere else in the house, and so they all just kind of fit in one drawer. So it's a well-used drawer within our kitchen, the junk drawer. This isn't a great way to introduce a sermon. I kind of feel like today's sermon is kind of like that. Aren't you excited? This is what I mean. These three things we're going to learn, I think, are critical if we're going to grow. But as we get into it, the transition from one to the other is a little bit, you kind of like, okay, what's the connection? And the only connection in some of this is just that they're all in the same place in the text, all right? So if you're wondering when I transition from point 1 to point 2, like what's the connection? There might not be much of one. Okay, so I'm just letting you know what's in store. So 3 things we have got to learn that come from this text. The first has to do with how do we engage our community. Now, for the past 3 weeks, we have seen Jesus in the narrative that John sets up for us. He has engaged 3 radically different types of people. 2 weeks ago, we saw that Jesus engaged this person named Nicodemus. Now, if you remember who Nicodemus was a respectable insider within the Jewish community. He was a teacher. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, which means he was well respected broadly, not just within his own particular sect of Pharisees, but he was respected broadly within Judea, within the Jewish community. And we see Jesus engage with him in a really remarkable way. Here he is, this respected man, Nicodemus. He engaged with the respectable kind of insider. What did we see last week? Last week we see Jesus engage a woman of Samaria. The Samaritan woman, she wasn't respectable. In fact, she was a moral outsider. She wasn't welcome within Judea. She didn't believe the right things, and her personal moral sort of background sectioned her off, marginalized her within the community. And yet you see Jesus engage her as well, break through all kinds of barriers, all sorts of racial, cultural, gender barriers. Jesus charged through all of those to engage with her. Today, we see Jesus, and he engages with a third person. Who is this person he engages with? Look here in the text. Look at verse 46. So he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made water wine, and at Capernaum there was an official whose son was ill. Now the word official here is a kind of complicated term. Some people wonder if this official was someone who was connected to King Herod, and so maybe he was a sort of an appointee of King Herod who was sort of over sort of the Jerusalem kind of at the time as a sub-king. Really, the king, the emperor Caesar was the real sort of person in charge at that time. But some people think he was sort of connected with him. Other people think that this person is more of a centurion, which is that this official is not connected to Judaism or to Judea at all. He's just accepted a post. He's from a long ways away from this area. He's a Gentile, and he is now sort of stationed in Judea, stationed in this area, actually north of Judea in Galilee, and that's where he is. So, doing all the research, it probably is that this person is a Gentile. So this person is not from this area, this setting that we've been reading about in Galilee. He's simply heard about Jesus, that he's miraculous, that he can do like these crazy things. His son is ill. He becomes desperate, and so he's willing to go to this man. Now, there's something really important that John is doing right now by arranging the narrative in the way that he has, by showing us the diversity of the kinds of people that Jesus engages with. Notice he goes from Jew to Samaritan to Gentile. He goes from Jewish sort of insider, respectable, to someone of Samaria who isn't respectable, who's a moral outsider, to someone who is a Gentile who doesn't even belong in the discussion if you're sort of from that region. Someone who's totally an outsider. And so what Jesus is doing is beginning to model for his disciples what mission looks like. One of the last things Jesus ever said to his disciples after he rose from the dead was this. It's in Acts 1:8. Look at this. He's giving his disciples final instructions before he ascends to the Father. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses where? In Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so how Jesus does mission in his earthly ministry is the same way he actually commands us, his disciples, to do mission, which is, it is a cross-cultural, cross-racial, cross sort of societal kind of barrier sort of mission. Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, to where the Gentiles are. So I want to just appreciate what John is doing here by highlighting this part of Jesus' mission. We need to pause and appreciate how radically different Jews and Samaritans and Gentiles are. We need to appreciate the social and cultural and racial differences that existed in the first century Palestine, and how those differences were intense, and that they created a societal polarization. They pulled people apart. Everyone felt that. Now, quick question. How many of you guys are sick of political ads? Yeah? My kids now they're at a point where we say anyone's name, and then Will or Ian will go. We're talking about Steve. Steve, he's too radical for Colorado. And it's like, wow, it's really in our culture right now. Can I just observe a reality in our community right now? Have we, in my lifetime, I don't ever remember being so polarized as we are right now. So polarized politically, socioeconomically, polarized even with our gender, polarized with race and cultural differences. We are incredibly polarized, and I don't want to just move on to the next sort of chapter of John without observing this thing that is true of Jesus, which is that social, cultural, and racial differences that polarized Jesus' community didn't polarize Jesus. The forces at play that polarized and that spread apart and that broke the fabric of Jesus' community didn't polarize Jesus. He went to the Jew, he went to the Samaritan, and he engaged the Gentile. Now, in engaging Nicodemus, the woman of Samaria, and this Gentile official, did Jesus, in personally engaging with him, did he compromise the truth? No, he did not. No, he didn't. We see when he's talking with Nicodemus a couple weeks ago, we see that he actually calls Nicodemus out for being ignorant. Nicodemus, you should know better. You're a teacher of the law. You could know better. Last week, when we see Jesus engaging with this Samaritan woman, we see that he brings to the surface this woman's moral background and her history. Now, he doesn't do it to shame her, but he did it to show her that her lifestyle was never going to give her what she really wanted. But he brought it to the surface. And today, in this story, this official wants his son to be healed, but Jesus kind of almost complains, and he says, you guys aren't going to believe unless you guys see a sign and a wonder. And he calls out their mixed motives. He calls out mixed motives. So he's not compromising in terms of telling the truth. And yet he said all of these things while staying engaged with the people who are different. What Jesus doesn't do is pull back and then complain about those people. We see him actually engage in the heat of the polarization, engaged with the wrong kind of people. He doesn't back down from the truth, but he remains engaged with him. He doesn't pull back and complain about them. And today, in our community that is incredibly polarized, not just politically, but even in our own neighborhoods, in the elementary school that my son goes to, I've never seen parents disagree so heatedly as parents in my own little community disagree. We have factions within the PTA. Are you kidding me? It's remarkable. It's remarkable. So, being a disciple of Jesus. So what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus in this time and in this place that is so polarized? Remember, a disciple of Jesus is someone who apprentices ourselves to him, and we have something really to learn. We need to resist the forces that polarize our community. We personally have to resist those forces. We, as followers of Jesus, have to be different. This is what Jesus talked about when you get to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. This is what he talked about. In John 17, he calls his disciples. He says, he's praying to the Father, and he says, I do not pray that my followers, I do not pray that you take them out of the world, but that you actually send them into the world, only sanctify them by truth. So this is an opportunity for us as disciples of Jesus not to get caught up in the things that polarize our community, but to model ourselves after Jesus, who never allowed the things that polarized his community to polarize him. He never gave in to that. Now, how do you know if you're doing this right? This is how you know based on the ministry of Jesus and on the rest of the New Testament. It's when our engagement with the community produces conviction of sin, not the creation of camps. You're doing this right, you're modeling yourself after Jesus whenever our engagement with the community, with people who are different, Jew, Samaritan, Gentile, just like Jesus, when our engagement produces actual conviction of sin, where people actually own their piece of the brokenness, rather than the creation of camps, where people just polarize all the more and just go into their different tribe. This is what we see with Jesus. And so we engage our community so that it produces real conviction, not the creation of camps. All right, that's number one. That's the first thing we have to learn just from seeing and observing who it is that Jesus engages with. So, something about community. The second thing we see in this text is something really important about Jesus. Notice what Jesus does. Jesus said to him, verse 48, Jesus said to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. The official said to him, sir, come down before my child dies. So the official is unconcerned about Jesus' complaint, about their beliefs, his beliefs of signs and wonders and the nature of belief. He's unconcerned. Verse 50, Jesus said to him, go, your son will live. The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him. So you notice that he actually believed before he actually saw whether or not his son was healed. Something about belief in there. The kind of belief that Jesus wants. And went on his way. As he was going down, his servants met him and told him his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better, and they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. The father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. All right. So there's something about Jesus that we have to learn, and that is this. In the Gospel of John, we are presented with Jesus, and we are forced to grapple with his divinity, and in particular, his divine power to heal. Now, in the other Gospels, in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see that Jesus is a miracle worker. He's doing remarkable things, but we're really sort of get a picture more of his humanity. He's a little bit more kind of relatable in that sense. But in John, we actually see that Jesus is divine. And we see him exercising divine power like only things that Jesus can do. Remember the first sign that he did was turning water into wine. Like how many people can relate to that? How many people can do that? Only Jesus. That's only something that's unique to Jesus. And with the story of the Samaritan woman, he knew her background before her actually sinned. So he like supernaturally knew her history. And now we see with the official son, Jesus says, your son will get well. And even though the son is about 14 miles away, at the exact same time he says it, the son does in fact get well. And so there's something about Jesus we have to learn in John that we have to lean into, that Jesus has divine, real power. That Jesus does miracles. And that he can and did, and that he does. And that's really hard for a lot of us to grapple with. That Jesus did miracles, even scientifically, it's hard for us to wonder if that's really the case. And then today, does Jesus still do miracles? I think what John is wanting us to see is that Jesus still has this power. Now, I wish I could get into all of the background to miracles and dealing with the supernatural, but I don't have time for it. What I can do is this. There's a book creatively entitled Miracles. It's written by C.S. Lewis. And in this book, and by the way, this book we have it on the bookshelves, just over there in the gallery. I encourage you to grab it. By the way, the books in the bookshelves, those, it says they're $10 kind of sort of suggested donation. We don't really care about the money at all. That's just so we don't lose a ton of money by people taking them. But listen, our hope is, and our reason we have those books over there is that you actually take them and read them, regardless of the money situation. So we bought 11 of these, and my hope is that after today we don't have any left. What C.S. Lewis does is he actually talks about the power of pre-belief, that a lot of us already have convictions against the possibility of miracles, against the possibility of supernatural intervention, and that because of those pre-beliefs, it actually determines whether or not we are open to experiencing real divine intervention. It's really a fascinating read, and I encourage you to go and look at it. How many of you are familiar with the Mayo Clinic? The Mayo Clinic, it's this incredible hospital with incredible results in Minnesota. There's a documentary right now, it's a Ken Burns documentary. It talks about the founding of the Mayo Clinic. And what's fascinating about the Mayo Clinic is that it's founded by this guy named William Mayo, and who is a confirmed agnostic, doesn't believe in the supernatural. However, he begins this clinic with a nun order, with an order of nuns, the Sisters of St. Francis. And together, this agnostic and nuns who pray a lot, they're able to see really remarkable things. At the very end of his career, before he died, people asked William Mayo whether he believed in God, and he said, I'm still an agnostic, however, I can say this. I can say that we would never have seen the results that we were seeing without the prayers of these nuns. I'll just leave it at that. It's a remarkable documentary. It's called The Mayo Clinic, Faith, Hope, and Science. So, what are we going to learn about Jesus? I think there's something for us as a community that we need to learn more and lean more into asking God for direct intervention with us. We're a very rationalistic, very reasonable, very Western place, community. Our church community is that way, and there's a lot of great things about that. I think we could really grow in actually asking God and leaning in for more of God's direct intervention. People in our community are actually hungry for it. I was sitting down at a coffee shop this week working on this sermon, and while I'm working on the sermon, dealing with miracles, in this coffee shop, there was a woman who sat down, and then there were 5 people who sat next to her, and then there was a TV station that came and filmed her, and she was a local psychic medium. And what was fascinating was how attracted people at this coffee shop and all the other customers, how attracted they were at the possibility. Could there be sort of this other world going on that this woman somehow could tap into? Like they were hungry for it. And I'm like, pump the brakes. And then I'm like, wait a second. As Christians, and as people who are connected to Jesus and the Spirit, we actually have connection to real spiritual power that isn't malignant, that isn't going to take advantage of people. Anyway, now you know what I think of psychic mediums. So there's something for us to learn about Jesus. Now, third thing is this. There's something for us to learn about belief. You notice that Jesus, he said, he complained, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And then he goes on and he heals this person's son. And there's an entire sort of pastoral question that many of us in this community, that many of you have had to deal with, and that is, why is it that Jesus heals some and not others? Jesus heals this official son's, his son. And yet I personally have known people who have more genuine faith than this official, and yet their child wasn't healed. And so why is that? Why is that? And I wish this morning I had the answer, that we could get into why is it that Jesus decided to heal this person's son, and as the narrative goes, we know there are a lot more people who didn't get healed. And I wish I knew the answer to that question. I don't. Several years ago, we taught through the Gospel of Mark, and part of our sort of private hope in teaching through the Gospel of Mark was that somehow we could sort of discover some sort of flow chart with Jesus. That if we followed his patterns enough, we would know like how to push the right buttons to get the right results so that people could get healed, that people could have that divine intervention. And I wish that we would have discovered it, but we didn't. And so for those of you who ask, okay, that's really good news for this official son, but why not mine? By the way, this month is Infant Loss Awareness Month. And it's touched so many families in our community. And if you're asking that question, I just want you to know that we see you. We weep with you. And we ask the same question that you ask, why? Job lost his entire family, and the response that he got by asking God was this response that God gave that is sometimes satisfying and sometimes not, which is that God is actually sovereign. And part of the heart of the mystery of doing life with the divine is that there's something we just don't know, and so we're left in a position of trust. Trust. So this now leads us into the nature of what it means to believe. What does it mean to believe? And what we see in this story, and then we see it repeated over and over, is this idea that miracles might spark belief, but they cannot sustain belief. The miracles are actually limited. The cool, crazy divine intervention is actually a limited thing. You see, this boy who was healed, maybe he grew up, maybe he didn't, but eventually he would become sick again. And there would be no healing. Even Lazarus, later we'll learn, Jesus actually raises his friend Lazarus from the dead. And it's this incredible story of Jesus having miraculous resurrection power. And yet the kind of resurrection Lazarus experienced, poor guy, he was going to get sick again and then have to die again. And he did. And so miracles are actually limited. In the Gospel of John, I think we're encouraged to know that Jesus has that power, and yet we're also to embrace the limitation of them. And so miracles can spark belief, and that's precisely what we see in this story. Look at the very last verse, or the second to last verse. The father knew this was the hour when Jesus had said to him, "Your son will believe." And he himself believed, and all his household. And this was now the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee. And so it sparked their belief, their trust in Jesus, but we now see that it won't necessarily sustain it. And so what does it mean to believe in a God of miracles? Sometimes we get divine intervention, and it can function as a spark. But then when you begin to trust in that spark, rather than what that spark is meant to lead us to, which is into a relationship with Jesus, then you go back to that spark over and over and over again, and it actually will suppress faith. This is why Jesus, at the very end of the Gospel of John, he said this to Thomas. Thomas got to see, he was lucky, he got to see the resurrected Jesus and put his finger into the side. But notice what Jesus said to him. Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas answered, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." All of these miraculous signs are just that, signs. Things that actually point to something else. And what do they point to? They point to an actual engagement with Jesus himself, who is better and more sustainable than the miraculous divine intervention. The thing itself is Jesus. Just like in a relationship, in a romantic relationship, there is attraction that can spark a relationship, but if you lean on that attraction all the time to sustain a relationship, it never works. So we see now in this text and in John that the miraculous spark can actually spark and create an intriguing kind of relationship with God, but it's the relationship with Jesus himself that's sustaining, not that spark that got you interested in the first place. And so this morning, there are three aspects of discipleship that I want us to embrace. There's an aspect of community. How are we engaging in community? Are we engaging with the Jew, the Samaritan, and the Gentile? Or do we like one more to the other, or we side with one more to the other? Jesus doesn't allow us to take sides like that. He doesn't permit us to be polarized like the rest of our community. Are we learning about Jesus, that he actually is God, that he's divine? And finally, are we learning more about the nature of our belief? Does our belief rest on whether or not the divine intervention happens, or will we actually begin to trust ultimately in the relationship with Jesus himself? And that's the thing that sustains us, not the initial spark of the miraculous. Let's pray. God, thank you for this text. And God, I pray that even though these three things may seem like a disjointed sort of things in a drawer, Lord, I pray that by your Spirit you would actually impress in each of us how important each of these three things are. God, I pray that we would ultimately use this text and be moved by this text to become disciples of yours who are recommitted to learning and to apprenticing and to having ourselves shaped by Jesus. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.